Welcome to Just One Q. I'm Dr. Melissa Horne, a diversity, equity, and inclusion advocate. In this podcast, I chat with industry experts and thought leaders about the latest trends related to diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. Each episode, I ask just one question tied to current events. The goal is to leave you with the tools that you need to drive change in your own life, both personally and professionally. A few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to be a guest on a new podcast. And one of the questions I was asked is, how does my workplace, dialectic, make me feel like I belong in the work that I'm doing? And it was, frankly, an amazing question and one that I've been reflecting on a lot since we recorded that episode. It's also made me think more about the work of DEI professionals, strategists, and consultants in general, and the sense of belonging that we find in the work that we do. So, for today's question, I'm asking, how do DEI professionals find belonging in the work that they do? To answer today's question, I'm joined by two amazing people who are really diving deeply into the topic of belonging with their new podcast, The Uncovering Belonging. I'm joined by Jade Pichette and Erin Davis. Erin and Jade, thank you so much for being here today.
Grateful to be on your podcast. I know I've listened to it many times, so it's really neat to be on it as well.
Yeah, now you have the behind the scenes look at how this all happens. So for those of you who don't know Jade and Erin, here's a bit about them. Jade Pichette is the Director of Programs, Pride at Work Canada. Jade is an inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility professional based in Toronto. At Pride at Work, Jade works with over 225 large employers across Canada around gender expression, gender identity, and sexual orientation inclusion. Previously, Jade served as the Volunteer and Community Outreach Coordinator at the Archives, the Education Programs Coordinator at Kindspace, and they continue to run an independent inclusion and diversity consulting business, as well as serving as an Ausatru Githia, priestess of the Vindazir Kindred. They were one of the authors of the Transitioning Employers, a survey of policies and practices for trans-inclusive workplaces, and they are the co-host of the Uncovering Belonging podcast. In their spare time, they can be found geeking out over queer, trans, and Norse histories, firekeeping, and spending time with their chosen family. And now for Erin. Erin is an award-winning expert, inspirational speaker, and global thought leader in the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion, helping people feel a sense of connection and belonging. She is the founder of Erin Davis Co. and lead inclusion strategist who helps leaders understand their role in creating a more inclusive workplace to unlock creativity and enhance innovation. Erin also empowers diversity and inclusion champions at all levels to find their voice and supports their journey to create a more inclusive world, one conversation at a time. She's passionate about social justice, committed to authentically and bravely challenging the status quo and helping others to make the same commitment. Okay, Erin and Jade, those are impressive bios, but I want to dig into this topic of belonging because I know that you've got a whole podcast around it. So maybe tell me about how you came to this topic and how this sort of supports the work that you're doing.
So Erin and I met in one of her previous roles, actually, when she was doing DEI at a large employer in Edmonton, and I was doing our Edmonton Pro Pride there. And so that's how we initially connected. But this concept of belonging is one that I know both of us really resonate with and really resonate in thinking about. And we think a lot about psychological safety as well. And without psychological safety, there is no belonging because you can't feel like your whole self there. And so I'm really interested to see, how do we move beyond these kind of tokenistic kind of efforts of traditional DEI, and especially when it's just DI, to this really kind of concept of belonging. And what does belonging look like? How do we make sure that people feel like they belong, both for the more practical purposes of, we know that people who feel like they belong do better work, they're more engaged, higher retention, all of those things that would go into a business case. But I think more importantly for both of us is just to make the world a better place, make it a place where people can see themselves, where they can feel like they are who they are. And so I think that is really what we're kind of trying to unpack with our discussion in terms of uncovering belonging, is this idea of how do we make the world a place where people are not having to hide pieces of themselves at work, that they feel safe, that they feel welcome, that they feel like all of themselves is actually valued. And I don't know that we're in a world where that can be the case yet, but I think that that's really what we're trying to engage with, is how do we get there? And where are those small moments too? Because
Mm.
sometimes it's the small moments of belonging that really make a difference.
So for you, Erin, how did you come to this idea of sort of belonging?
I go back to my own journey, and I think that we all individually know our story best. And as cliche as that sounds, I led a career in what we would characterize as male dominated spaces. And when I look back, really questioned if I ever showed up as my true self. Did I ever really know who that was in a corporate setting? Because from day one, I made observations of what success had to look like, and really felt that I had put myself into a place of showing up in a way that would allow my career to advance and allow my goals and ambitions to be met as well. But then I got to a place in my career where I hit the proverbial glass ceiling, and all of a sudden I wasn't able to climb the corporate ladder anymore. And as an aside for any listeners, I don't really care about the corporate ladder anymore, but early in my career it was definitely a motivator. And that for me is this journey of, okay, who am I? And so as Jade explains sort of these conversations that we've been having, it's an exploration of, when we say these big fancy words of we want to create a place of belonging, lots of organizations are saying this, but how? How do we do that? And it's through these individual stories that Jade and I have been able to capture that I think we're starting to really unlock what that can look like and challenge what it means to show up and truly belong. Because I also remember a time where we said, oh, the person I am at work is not the person I am outside of work. And that is not the end goal that we want to see for anyone who we have conversations with, anyone inside of organizations. We are indeed the same person every single day. It doesn't matter where we exist.
So I want to go back to this idea of how doing the work that you're doing right now allows you to feel that sense of belonging, or the community that you're, creating with the podcast and together. So for you, Jade, how is it that being in this space, doing DEIB work, allows you to feel like you belong?
So as a trans feminine person, as a non-binary person, as an autistic and proudly disabled person who also have certain privileges as a white person with certain levels of education, although I did also grow up poor, I didn't have a space for myself professionally. I went to school for social work after I got my master's degree, and this shocks a lot of people. I had to take my master's degree off my resume to start getting callbacks with work, and work that was way under my level, and consistently told, you're just not the right fit. And I think every person who is, especially when I talk to women of color, fellow trans folks, that's a phrase we're pretty common and know quite often. And so for me, I've wound up in this space because I couldn't find work elsewhere. And I couldn't even find any other type of work, even in the field that I had went into. So for me, this work is life-saving in many ways. I was 1 month away from my EI running out and having to put all my stuff in storage and live off of people's couches before I got this job. I felt like a chance was being taken on me just because, even though I had all this experience and knowledge and education, I had never been welcomed into most spaces. And then when I often was very tokenistic and not really who I am. And so finally, I'm working in a space where I'm able to bring those pieces of myself and have them seen as a benefit instead of a deficiency, which is a huge difference to what I'm used to. And I think what a lot of equity deserving folks are used to is that often those parts of ourselves where we don't experience privilege, where we experience marginalization, are these pieces that hold us back, right? And sometimes we hide some of those pieces of ourselves. And I definitely have done some of that in terms of my disability pieces in past, because no matter what, everybody knew I was a trans person.
Right.
Everybody knew I was queer. Those were pieces of myself that I couldn't hide at work. And so those were pieces of myself that I had to always show regardless, because some of us can't hide it. Like some of us, it's out there. We're not an invisible minority. We're very visible. And for me, I'm actually able to, in this nonprofit space, institute change in these large employers and see the changes that are actually happening in practice. And I think that's one of the reasons why I feel so much belonging in this space, is because those pieces of myself are a benefit. I still get the occasional, people treating me like infantilizing me when they find out I'm autistic, which I think is not okay. Like, it's just a different neurotype. I still find that for the most part, those are benefits. And me coming from that lived experience without having to talk about all of it is still seen as a benefit and as part of my expertise. And then also I just get to work with a lot of really great folks, like I get to choose who I work with in a way that I haven't always gotten to do in the work that I've done before. Like Erin and I, we're not at the same organization, but we're getting to work together, right, on this project, because we know we work well together, we like each other. And so when you're getting to do that with people, that does create more of that belonging, which I'm very grateful for, but I'm also very aware that that's usually not the case for most people.
Great teams fuel great business. In the office, on the road, in the field, and around the world, your people are working together to make it happen, to make something new, to do something better, to delight customers again and again. At Dialectic, we believe that even the best teams can get better. Dialectic is a learning company obsessed with helping teams reach their potential. Using person-centered, empathetic design and social science research methods, we build digital and in-person training that helps your people build habits that unlock enthusiastic collaboration and true belonging. For example, Learning Snippets is a diversity, equity, and inclusion micro-learning program that helps your people build inclusive habits in 3 minutes or less. Your team can practice living your organization's values with off-the-shelf programs like inclusive leadership, gender identity, or offsetting racial bias. Or let Dialectic design a solution tailored to your needs, from digital transformation and difficult conversations to disaster preparedness or design thinking. Learn more about how Dialectic could help unlock your team's potential at dialectic.solutions. And if you want to see how Learning Snippets puts DEI concepts into action, you'll find the link in the show notes. And now back to the show. So what about you, Erin? You mentioned that you just were sort of done with the ladder, you'd hit the glass ceiling. And so how does this work create that sense of belonging for you?
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. And, I resonate with a lot of what Jade said in terms of these environments in which, I'll share my experience. I just felt like my voice wasn't heard. And, I sometimes questioned, was it an age factor in terms of me being more junior and compared to others who are in the space? But as you do more research in this space of equity, diversity, and inclusion, you start to read the research and go, I wonder if it was unconsciously because I'm a woman in a room of men, or is it because I'm a woman of color, which took me a long time to sort of identify as. Yes, I get that my skin color is brown, but it wasn't until I started to do the research that I was like, is this holding me back? And so for me, it was an absence of my voice and my creativity and my ideas being heard. So yeah, it wasn't people weren't being rude. I was still able to share my perspectives, but did they help to shape the outcomes that were happening inside of organizations? I felt like they weren't. And so you get to a point where you're like, I want to change that direction. I want to have the opportunity, like Jay just said, to enter into a great idea. Our podcast came about through conversation and having these open, honest conversations with one another and building a virtual relationship, because honestly, we haven't seen each other in person for 3 years. And yet we're able to engage in really great dialogue because we leveled up and created trust and created connection and allowed that to lead our relationship going forward. And that for me is sometimes what's lacking inside of organizations, the creation of trust, the letting down of perceived barriers, that at the end of the day, we're all human and we all have something valuable to bring to the table, because that's why we were invited to the table. And so I'm just like playing that soundbite out in my mind, because I know we also struggle to get people at the table, but I also want to make sure that when you do have a seat there, that your voice is heard. And for me, I'm really able to create those spaces now within my business of showing up and being seen as the thought leader and being seen as, we want to listen to your expertise in this space because you have this lived experience. You've done this work inside of large organizations. And at the end of the day, I get to push up and bump up against like, what does the new working world look like? And how do I create that belonging as my organization grows, which is pretty exciting.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. One of the things that I love about, having my own podcast, and I'm sure you're starting to maybe experience, is just having the conversations with other thought leaders, with other professionals. And really, for me, I'm always learning. I'm learning every time I sit down and I talk to someone. It's shifting, or it's, causing me to think and reflect on, my own beliefs, or making me think about something in a different way. And for me, it's funny because there has been this community that's been created in a way virtually that we wouldn't have been able to do potentially before, that now that we've moved online in a way. I mean, obviously I kind of still miss the in-person, those moments, but it's really created, where we just wouldn't have had those opportunities to connect in the same way. So in terms of, your hopes for sort of what the podcast can do, and really, I think because, this is hard work, obviously, right? And, for folks with lived experiences going into doing this work, it can be hard. It can be challenging. There's all great successes. And there are times where, organizations don't budge, oftentimes of, I won't say failure, but setbacks, right? So, what do you want to do with this? Because I think it's beautiful. I love the idea of belonging. I love your stories, and I love, the feeling of what belonging creates. But what is your hope with the podcast?
I mean, I just want to see more moments of connection is part of it. And, even if our like folks who come on our guests don't always feel belonging in all of the work that they do, because sometimes that's the story that comes up.
Mhm.
I at least hope that they have a moment with us, where they feel like they belong, where they feel like they're valued. And first and foremost, before all the listeners, that is my first hope, right? Is to make sure that they have a welcoming and an experience where we are able to see all of them, or as much of them as they want to share publicly. Because that's also a thing, is that not everybody feels like sharing everything about themselves publicly, and that's okay too. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just whether you're doing that out of safety and a feeling like you have to hide yourself, versus a feeling of like, that's just not my way of engaging with the world, because those are two different things in my opinion. But also, I am hoping that we try to uplift this conversation DEI away from just kind of these tokenistic efforts to, as Erin was talking about, outcomes. Like I would love to see somebody come back and say, hey, I listened to the podcast and it made me think of this great new way that we could change the way that we're engaging in our work, and see some of those changes actually happen. How is that impacting people, whether that's just in a moment as a listener, feeling like you're seeing somebody that you, or at least hearing, I should say, somebody that you can relate to, or that maybe you can't, and you're learning as a result. So it's kind of all those moments, from the moment of the guest, the moment of the listener, and their like experience of belonging and learning about the quote unquote other of somebody else, but also hoping that there's changes that happen. What about you, Erin?
Well, wow. I don't know if I could have said it any better than you just did. For me, it is a showcase of stories from people that may not necessarily have the fullest platform yet. And what I mean by that is Jade and I had a really important conversation when we were pulling this together to say, how can we make sure that we are capturing voices that maybe aren't always heard? And that was really important to us as well. And I know that when I worked inside of organizations, we would start down the pathway of talking about diversity and inclusion and say, oh, well, we need to bring this person in. And it would always be the same person. And it felt really tokenized. And so we want to elevate all voices in these conversations and really think about whose voice hasn't been heard. So that's important. I think through our conversations, we also find space to role model, to help others through conversation as well, because we don't always have the right words, and we live in a world where we can default to silence and not saying anything at all, and finding time to connect with others who are different than us. And so I truly believe if we knew someone's story, it could change our perspectives of them. And we don't find the time always to understand people's stories. So if we can role model that to organizations and to individuals listening to the podcast, this investment in time to get to know someone is the start of the journey for them finding their true sense of belonging, then I think we've accomplished something for our conversations. So yeah, just additive to what Jade said.
Oh, that was wonderful. And I was going to ask Jade, what's one thing that you'd like our listeners to take away from our conversation today? I know you just had this beautiful summary, but what's the one thing that folks could take away from today?
Find those moments and what it means for you to belong, and that what of those pieces do you want to bring forward, and think about how could that actually happen. For some people, that means you might have to switch jobs. For some, it means that you need to, find more spaces within your family where you're able to be who you are. For some, it means going away and being away from people, quite honestly, if that works most for them. But in addition to that, how can you make those around you feel like they belong more too? And it really is about those moments of connection. And I think, especially in this virtual world, we spend so much time in very much professional situations where I know previous to the pandemic, I had a lot more moments that were like just kind of talking to people, engaging, connecting. And now it's like, okay, if you're not here for the Zoom meeting at 11:01, you are late for the meeting. And so, really, I think we need to spend more of those time and more time in creating connection and asking each other, what will make you feel like you belong, and reflecting it back. Do that with your teams, do that with your colleagues, do that with your family and the other folks in your life.
And Erin, what's the one thing you'd like folks to take away?
Maybe for me, it's a piece of encouragement to ensure that you have space in your day to reflect on who you are. And are you able to bring that forward in every space that you exist in? And if you can, take the opportunity to create that space for someone else. And so think about who's in your network, think about those individuals that you work with. And even if it's for 15 minutes, reach out to someone and initiate a conversation and see where it can take you.
So I'm excited about your podcast coming out. There's going to be a ton of fantastic conversations, and we're going to make sure that we have the link to the Uncovering Belonging podcast in our show notes. We'll also make sure that we have Erin and Jade's contact details as well. And as always, if you have any of your own questions, or if you'd like to be a guest on the show, please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. Erin and Jade, thank you so much for joining me today. I always have a wonderful time speaking with you both. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having us.
Until next time, I'm Dr. Melissa Horne, and this is Just One Q.